Well, thank you all so much again for coming. Again, I'm the president of the National Press Club and also a military reporter. I am not a veteran, but I have written and earned several honors and awards, including the Defense Media Award for Best Young Defense Journalist in 2018 and Best Land Systems Submission in 2020. I have no military background at all. In collaboration with military veterans in journalism, I'm proud to moderate this panel on Veterans Day to talk about how we as an industry can improve news coverage around military and veterans affairs, including by getting more vets in the news. Part of that effort begins right now. Military Veterans in Journalism is launching its Military and Veteran Reporting Guide today. And again, check that out. And we're glad to have you all join us today to talk about these important issues while we celebrate the service of members of our armed forces. Before we get into it, I'd like to introduce the panel. We have Bob Woodward, who is a Navy veteran and an associate editor at the Washington Post. Alongside fellow Post reporter Carl Bernstein, Bob famously investigated the Watergate scandal in 1972. He has received nearly every major journalism award for his work, and his coverage of Watergate and the 9/11 attacks contributed to the Post winning 2 Pulitzer Prizes. We have Zack Baddorf, who is a Navy veteran as well, national security and foreign policy practitioner, and the executive director of Military Veterans in Journalism. He has more than 15 years of experience covering military conflicts and humanitarian disasters in places like Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and Afghanistan, and his work has been published by the New York Times, Washington Post, the Associated Press, and the BBC, among others. Zack also teaches about disinformation at NYU. And next we have Ron Nixon, who's a Marine Corps veteran and now Vice President overseeing investigative enterprise and grants and partnerships for the Associated Press. Prior to his work with the AP, he spent over a decade covering violent extremism and homeland security for the New York Times. And Mr. Nixon has also co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting and is a steadfast advocate for diversity, including veteran diversity, in his field of specialty and in newsroom leadership. And last but not least, we have Allison Erickson, also joining us today, an Army veteran and MVJ's Military and Veterans Affairs Reporting Fellow at the Texas Tribune. She has previously written for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Texas Monthly, and The Point. Ms. Erickson contributed to the style guide we'll be introducing today, and we are very grateful for her joining us from Texas. So thank you so much. As we get started, since it's Veterans Day, I'd like to hear about some of the stories of your service. So let's hear from each of you about your time in the military and how it affected your journalism, and I'll start with Zack.
Thank you. I'll dominate the conversation for a few minutes here. Thank you for your time. So I was in the Navy from September 2001 through September 2006. It was a very interesting time to be in the military. And I did storytelling about the military for the military, public affairs, basically. And did video and radio and photo and print all over the Middle East and Asia, and I had an incredible experience doing that. I then thought, well, I'll get out and use these skills and a bachelor's in journalism to work in civilian media, in journalism. But the transition was quite rough. It was very difficult. I applied for jobs across the country and really struggled, in part because I didn't have any mentors, I didn't have a network, and I didn't really know what I was doing. It was a real challenge. Not a sob story. At the end of the day, I've done freelancing, as Jen mentioned, here and there, and I'm very proud of the journalism work that I've done over the years. I also informally mentored other vets who were interested in journalism and wanted to do more in this field, but we're having some of those same challenges that I went through. So I and my co-founder, Russell Midori, a Marine, he and I created the organization to create opportunities to work to diversify newsrooms, to get more vets into journalism. And so with my service as a background and my personal commitment to this issue, it's led to the foundation of Military Veterans in Journalism in 2019. So I'm very glad to be here with you all.
Thank you. Right, Ron, you've been in newsrooms for a few years, and now you have a senior role at the AP. So tell us about your military experience and how you got into the news.
You say a few years, is that like a nice way of calling me old? So, well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to be on the panel with everybody, including a hero of mine, Mr. Woodward. It's just unbelievable to be on the same panel. So I joined the Marine Corps in 1988. So I was in from 1988 to 1992. I have like no background in journalism. I was a music major in college, and so my goal was to write music for TV and movies, and that was what I planned to do. Obviously, that didn't work out. So I joined the Corps, and nobody in my family. I'm from a small, I wouldn't say town, but my wife would like disagree with that. I'm from a small community in Mississippi of about 437 people. So there's really nothing there to do. So I joined and didn't really know anything about the military. Nobody in my immediate family been in the military. So when I joined, and they said, well, you know, you're going to be in infantry. And I was like, cool. I had no idea what infantry meant, so.
Did you learn?
Yes, I learned quickly. So my first, after boot camp, I did go to infantry immediately. I was an assignment as so that the MLS, or military occupation specialty for infantry, is 03. So I was 0341s, 81 millimeter mortars, which we call death from above, and death from a distance. But I was 8152, which is Marine Security Forces, the counterterrorism portion of the Corps, and was based in Norfolk, Virginia. Also had some time abroad, but did that until the Iraqis invaded Kuwait in 1990. And 2 weeks after that, I got orders to go to Camp Lejeune. And about 2 weeks after that, I was in a foxhole in Riyadh. And so, you know, we fought the whole 100-hour war with the oil fields on fire and everything. And so after I got out of, we came back, I was on temporary I&I duty, instructor duty. These are active duty Marines who train reservists. And so I did that, and then had a choice to re-enlist. So I thought about journalism, actually, or counterintelligence. And so I was like, oh, they're kind of the same. And so, but a friend of mine who I had interned at a small newspaper before I came into the Marine Corps, spent 6 months doing that, and so he convinced me to come out and just go and try this journalism thing. Incidentally, the guy who gave me my start in journalism is Isaac Washington, who's a Marine. And he co-founded the Montford Point Marines Association. The Montford Point Marines are where the African American Marines trained, and he was one of the founders of the organization that advocates for them. So, you know, worked at doing high school sports and music reviews for a small black newspaper. But anyway, went from that to doing other things, and accidentally fell into investigative reporting. Not pretty, we can talk about that later. But, and then just kept thinking that I would eventually get this music thing going. So, still thinking. But anyway, we can talk more about that later. But that's sort of my journey into journalism.
All right, well, next up, Oscar for Best Soundtrack. Allison, you're an MVJ fellow, and you're relatively new in your journalism career. So what motivated you to get into journalism, and what are some of the military experiences that have helped shape qualities as a reporter?
Sure. First, I want to thank everyone for even allowing me to sit on this panel. There is quite a gap between career length from this end to that end. We didn't do this on purpose, but it really is this direction. My interest in journalism, I always actually have been interested in it because some of my favorite writers started out as journalists, and I was very interested in writing from a young age. And I actually studied journalism in undergrad, but I had an ROTC scholarship, and I thought communications, that's the way I'm going to go. I like to talk. So it turned out, though, that at the time, I don't know if it's changed, the Army didn't have a direct entrance into the PAO field, so I couldn't use all these skills that I had gained unless I maybe went MI or some other assignment, and I didn't think I was going to enjoy MI. I mentally was like, I don't think I can do that. And my mother had been medical in the Army Medical Department, so I chose Medical Service Corps because I'm also an Army brat. So I grew up on Fort Sam, went to school there, graduated from there, and then thought, why not come home for trainings? So that's as much of the decision as I made as far as my active duty career. I was in the Army for 7 years. I think I wrote one DVIDS hub worthy piece, which really sort of solidified for me that I really want to do this. I want to continue in journalism. But I didn't really have the pathway to do that while I was active duty, doing something I really had no training to do initially, but then just really had to learn. And I became very good at my job in Medical Service Corps. When I finally left for family reasons, I also knew I wanted to get back into journalism. So I went to graduate school to sort of transition, but also use the GI Bill to kind of buoy me in that time post-service. I got a degree in creative publishing and critical journalism from the New School. I should mention that I got my undergrad at Texas Christian University, so those two schools are on complete opposite spectrums, if you're tracking any of them, and I was very grateful for both experiences. And then afterward, I was trying to freelance. I really knew, though, that I wanted to work in the newsroom, and it wasn't until MVJ came along that I finally got my foot in the door. It was hundreds of jobs. I applied to hundreds of jobs in various levels, varying degrees of communications, not just journalism. And I found that the main thing missing was someone to kind of help hold that door open for me. And I love the Texas Tribune, so.
Was your editor in the audience? Bob, you were in the Navy in the 60s as a communications officer, so tell us about how you transitioned from the military into the news.
Let's see, I mean, real quick. I got out of college in 1965. I was in NROTC, and so they were going to send me off on a ship, and they sent me to a ship called the USS Wright, Command Communication Ship, designated as the National Emergency Command Post afloat, a relocation site for the President of the United States, who then was Lyndon Johnson, in case of nuclear war. And there were 1,000 men, all men, on this converted light aircraft carrier with all kinds of antennas. And because I'd been a radio ham, they decided to designate me with another officer to have custodial control of the sealed authentication system for launching nuclear war. And two brief lessons from that. All of a sudden they'll give you, at a very young age in the military, a responsible position that actually no one should have, but it was mine. And I learned in the course of that, living with, because they had a JCS operations team that would come aboard when we had the duty, and there was another ship, the Northampton. And I mean, this is really the guts of nuclear war. If you've seen, it's true. You have to have an authenticated order from NCA, National Command Authority. And the radio men on the ship decided, well, you know, we're all using teletypes at this point, so we will pre-cut tapes for the orders from the National Command Authority to the 8 sinks telling them to launch nuclear war. And so they were on a board and all the options, and I realized that the system of 2-person control was weak, and Lieutenant J.G. Atherton and I had a big safe where we had all of these key cards for the top secret point-to-point circuits, but we had 2 little safes with the authentication codes in them, one for practice exercises, one real. And I realized that when I was off the ship, Atherton, who was a very solid guy, could have gone into the safe and with a dinner knife pried open the authentication system and taken one of the tapes off the board and given the order for the single integrated operation plan, which is the nuclear war plan. So that was perfect training for journalists because you realize that human beings are the ones who make the decisions, and no system will keep human beings contained from accidents or their worst impulses, right? So, and then I was on other ships, but I'll tell you, and if you'll bear with me on something, that when I became a journalist and was doing lots of work at national security issues, wars, I've written 6 books on the various wars we've had, beginning with the first Gulf War. And Ray Odierno, the general, any of you know him, who was Chief of Staff of the Army, commander in Afghanistan, Iraq. I got to know him, and he would have the new generals, 1-stars, come to Washington for a kind of seminar for a week, and he would ask me to come talk about the media, which I was happy to do, and then I would send around a sign-up sheet and say that I would send copies of my latest book if they would just give me their address and the duty station that they had, and that was my to-do list for the next month, of getting in touch with these people. A very interesting group of people. Some of them were still colonels, some of them have 1-star. So Odierno gets up and, you know, big bear of a man, and walks down the alley and says, generals, what's the job of the Army? And everyone raises their hand, essentially, and he picks on one, stands up. Chief, the job of the Army is to recruit, equip, and train soldiers to fight and win wars, and everyone knows. And then Odierno says, generals, what is the second job of the Army? Second job? They didn't tell us they had a second job. Anybody know what the second job of the Army is?
I'll guess it's the keep the American people informed of what's going on. I don't know.
Okay. That was a guess.
That's why I didn't make general.
But here, I mean, so he said, generals. And they really, all 100 of them, there are 110 of these, you know, this is the future of the Army. They're looking at it. And so Odierno said, generals, the second job of the Army, and it may be the first job of the Army, is to prevent war.
Yes.
Amen. And they kind of all look around, and Well, that makes sense. Let's work on that. Now, I've written books on certain presidents over the years, which I don't think they understand the second job of the Army or the military, because preventing war is really at the core of making the military strong and coherent in the country. And I got to know Colin Powell in over many, many decades and so forth. And the first book I wrote was war, was the commanders about the first Gulf War. And Newsweek did a cover story of the book, and they had a painting of Powell because he wouldn't pose for a picture. And the headline was "The Reluctant Warrior." And so Powell got around to writing his memoirs, and his agent told him, "Now don't tell him you're not running for president, because then no one will want to buy or read the book." And so he held off doing that. And then when the book came out, and he said I called him the Reluctant Warrior, and he had a one-word answer: guilty. Guilty. Anyway, I'm sorry to take time on that, but I think in dealing with the press and the public and so forth, that some of these kind of basics are not understood, and the core convictions of the people who actually have seen war know how ugly it is, how risky it is, how uncertain it is. And I don't think I was surprised that we have 100 one-star generals who are about to, did not know. I'll stop.
Well, thank you, Bob. Lots to think about there. Can you just to follow up, talk about how you got your first job in news? You get out of the Navy, so what happened?
Yeah, and I realized I carelessly signed up for Naval ROTC in 1961. My father had been in the Navy, and his uniform hung in the closet, and John F. Kennedy had just been elected president, and so thought, well, and the saying went around that the draft was inevitable. I didn't know Dick Cheney or Bill Clinton at the time. I'm just, it's inevitable, so I signed up for. So then when I was getting out of the Navy, I realized it's best to not make a careless decision and think about. So I applied for jobs. I've sent out for CIA application. I never sent it in, but I applied for business jobs. I walked down to the Washington Post one day and said, "I'd like to work here." And they said, "You have no experience." And they gave me a 2-week tryout, which I failed, but I realized I loved journalism. This is one of the things that happens to you if you're lucky. And so I got a job at a weekly paper for a year and had some stories that the Post wished they had, so they hired me. That's how they solved that problem. And then I was working there 9 months, and the Watergate burglary occurred. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and the editors sat around and said, "Now, wow, it's nice outside. This is Saturday morning. Who would be dumb enough to come here and work?" And they immediately thought of me because I liked it. And so they sent me to the courthouse, and I've been covering night police for 9 months. And in come the 5 Watergate burglars all dressed in business suits. Now, I had never in 9 months seen a burglar in a business suit. In fact, I'd never seen a well-dressed burglar. But there they were, and the judge asked where they worked, and they had James McCord finally answered CIA, and I was sitting in the front row, and I blurted out, "Holy shit."
What a day to show up for work.
No, I was awakened. You know, will you come in? Literally.
Oh. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about the hard reality now. Veterans are vastly underrepresented in America's newsrooms. I'm fortunate enough to work in a newsroom that has heavy representation of veterans since I cover the military, but we know that's not the case throughout the United States. So about 8% of Americans have served in the armed forces, but veterans make up just 2% of American journalists. So Zack, why do you suppose that is the case?
It's a very complex answer to that question. There are a lot of factors. One of the things for sure is the military-civilian divide. Back in the era where Bob was in the military, a lot more people were drafted. There was a larger percentage. More Americans were affected by the wars. Now, if you look at the post-9/11 era, we're talking 1-2% of Americans who serve. And the people who are coming into the journalism world, the vast majority of them have never served. And they go to schools like Columbia. No diss on Columbia, it's a great school. But they go a traditional route. There's a normal route where people get into journalism, and veterans just don't meet that standard route. They go different ways. When I got out of the military, I didn't go to a fancy school. I couldn't afford to live in New York, for example, or DC, and go to, it just would not have been possible. I couldn't do an internship where I get paid $0. They're getting better at internships, but the pay is still pretty garbage. So it's a lot of it some of it comes down to class as well. It also comes down to elitism. There's a lot of stigma and a lot of stereotypes about veterans, and there are academic studies that prove this in terms of how HR people look at veterans. Can they be a security guard? Absolutely, they'll sign you up right away. Can you be a journalist and have emotional intelligence? No. That's the perception of, according to academic studies on this subject. So there's a lot of real challenges, and some outlets are better than others. I'm proud to say the Washington Post has a fellowship spot specifically for a veteran every year, thanks to a partnership with us. CNN, NPR as well are partners of ours. A lot of other outlets just aren't willing to invest. Ron knows this, I'm working on diversity on other categories of people, so whether it be looking at increasing diversity of race, of ethnicity, gender, all these things, there's the traditional route in, and many of these other communities just don't go that traditional route. And so it's a challenge to push these outlets who can afford to do it, to invest in the diversity for betterment of the different communities, as well as the publications, increasing the quality of their reporting, and then also I would say the consumers of the news media as well. Ultimately, they're the ones who are going to get the better quality reporting as a result of having more diverse reporters.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this issue? Okay, all right. Well, so all too often in the news, and this is for you, Ron, I think we see stories about veterans committing violent acts which are blamed on their mental health. And you working at the AP, how do you cover these critical issues around veterans' mental health, particularly PTS, with nuance to ensure you don't contribute to stigma or feed into stereotypes about vets?
So, a couple of things here. I think that, one, we do have a few veterans in the newsroom, and we sort of serve as an informal counsel to other reporters there. I mean, I don't do a lot of daily reporting. I don't do any reporting. But I think the thing is there's a lot of sort of Ramboism, right? Like where you think that these vets are damaged and they're somewhere with a big knife and they're just ready to set off. Or you have the people were damaged in the Gulf War or the various wars that we fought since Iraq and Afghanistan. But just getting people to actually talk to veterans organizations before starting to write about, and this is not just mental health, it's just throughout. One of the things that we encourage people to do is never just talk about when a veteran does something and you say, well, this person had military training. What does that even mean? Right? Like if you're a cook, you had military training. Right? Or if you're a journalist, you had military training. Like what does that mean? But be specific and don't stereotype veterans in any way that you would any other group, because veterans aren't the only ones that suffer from PTSD. But there are smart ways to write about, and there are organizations that are out there that can answer questions smartly about this issue. And again, I mean, I think also having veterans in high leadership roles also helps, because I can say like that's stupid, like let's not do that. And again, to Zach's point, like, at one point that was the norm because people were drafted and most people served in the military. But now we don't have that. So what the perception that people get for veterans is basically what they see on TV or in pop culture. And a lot of the pop culture has to do with the same thing. The damaged vet, the vet who came back home, can't fit in. And what's supposed to do with that? I mean, that's the thing. Well, to a degree. Especially Marines. Kind of a little weird.
Sure.
Yeah. But that's the thing. I think if you are a good journalist, right? Good journalism dictates that you consider all of the factors, and in that also means that knocking down any preconceptions that you have and looking at what's the facts rather than thinking like, oh, well, I know that because not all vets have PTSD. So anyway, long-winded way of saying that.
Just there's this phrase, I love this phrase, the relentless momentum of the status quo. And that's what happens is, oh, well, that's the way we've done it. We recruit from the journalism schools and so forth. And we, in journalism, no, it's all about pushing. You've just got to push. And I will get lots of emails or letters or communications from people. Can I help them get a job? And I mean, I shouldn't say this, but when I get the third or fourth request from the same person, then I say, there's someone who gets the idea. You just don't send out 50 letters and everyone's gonna respond. And someone will come back, now I know I've contacted you before, but I'm doing it again, and not embarrassed by it. Because journalism is knocking on doors. We were just talking about the Pentagon. They let journalists in the Pentagon and wander around the halls. And Admiral Crowe, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the 80s, was Reagan's chairman, and I got to know him quite well, and he said, God damn it, why do we let journalists in the Pentagon? Why don't we keep them out? And I mean, as you know, I've done it. You get that press pass, you go right in, and you can knock on the Secretary of Defense's door. Maybe you will have to wait a while or come back the next day, but you can literally talk to anyone. You can go down to the NMCC and they'll say, well, you're not cleared, and then you can say, well, can I just kind of walk through? And you can actually walk through. So anyway, it's all about being aggressive. We used to have a little sign that we put on the computers of people in the investigative unit at the Post. It was FAA, and it's not Federal Aviation Administration. It means focus, act aggressively. Simple.
Jen, can I
Yes,
make one
absolutely.
small point, something that Zach said about getting out and not having it. A lot of times when you get out as a veteran, whatever your MLS is, that tends to dictate what you do when you get out. Like infantry, two of my roommates are now in Homeland Security investigations, and one of them is in the Border Patrol. That's the trajectory. So you get out, and I'm spiritual with law enforcement, right? Because that's what I know. I have no sense that I could actually be a journalist. Because
So you prove the basic truth in journalism. It's important to know nothing.
That's very
And come
true.
in as a blank slate.
That is very
No,
true.
seriously, I mean, you can't, I listened to a high official the other night in the Biden administration give the worst speech I've ever heard. Because it was, assume people know certain things and, no, don't. What do you do here? And knock on doors. 4-star general. When do you go knock on a 4-star general's house who won't answer you and you're working on? When do you go? When's the best time? Zach? When did you go?
Anytime you want. Keep pounding.
6 a.m. or 6 p.m.
3 o'clock in the morning.
No, because the general's out running around doing exercises so he'll look like a colonel. That's the worst time to go. Turns out the best time to go is 8:17 p.m. on a Tuesday night, roughly sometime after 8 o'clock. And if the general's home or the person you want to talk to is home, maybe they're relaxing, or at least they're not out someplace else. I remember going knocking on this general, very well-known general, and he wouldn't talk to me, not email, intermediaries, and I just knocked on the door, and he opened the door and looked at me and he said, "Are you still doing this shit?"
I have never knocked on a general's door, but now I feel motivated to do that.
But if you go at 6 a.m., you're going to get shot.
I won't be awake. I'm a journalist. I won't be awake at 6 a.m. I think that's about as early as Army ever has any type of event, is around 6:30. So
Yes.
6 p.m. I would love it if each of you could, maybe present a couple of anecdotes on how your institutional knowledge and experience in the military helped you in journalism, in a particular story or a particular something that you were working on, how it helped. And I'll start with you.
Great. I don't want to raise my voice, so I'm using the mic. I can think of it in several ways, even now on the beat that I'm doing, which is Military and Veterans Affairs for Texas. It's come in handy, one, just understanding how the military works, having grown up even on a military base, a large installation in the state. Knowing, I know generally where the generals live, both on post and off post. Like, there are just certain places where people go, there's a certain kind of rhythm. But I also, even when it comes to stories, like sniffing out good stories, I was doing a lot of run-of-the-mill basic stuff for this fellowship, and it was fine. It wasn't very captivating. It was just very, almost like boilerplate, getting a beat down stories, and this very interesting story came across my desk, and I pitched it to my editor. He's like, you got this other thing you're working on. I was like, but this is a great story. I mean, I know that these are important stories. All of the journalism that we do is important to a degree, but here's why it's great. It has to do, I'm not completely done yet, but I'll give you like a preview. Afghan immigration detention at the southern U.S.-Mexico border. And we're talking about some of the people that I'm particularly researching worked closely with U.S. forces. So the policies that we've concocted and created ourselves are now inadvertently targeting people who have helped us for the past 20 plus years. And it took me fighting for that story and for that story to be told appropriately, because there was a lack of context about the timeline for this story. And it just so happens to be in Texas. So it has national scope and impact, but it's also something that I felt comfortable reporting as well, because, for example, I deployed to Afghanistan. I have some cultural competency. And I felt like, okay, I know how to present at this, one person's home. I'm familiar with the customs and courtesies. I, would do my best not to offend someone so I can gain their trust in order to tell their story appropriately. And I think for me, it's been an important story to tell, but I only think I could have told it because I was military, because in some senses, I've fought alongside with these people. That's one very specific example. I don't know. It's not one that you would see everywhere, but that's one that I've seen play out in real life, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned trust, Allison, because I think that's a key component here. I reflect on a panel that Knight sponsored of the launch of Semaphore. You all may be familiar with this new outlet. They talked primarily about trust, and trust in communities, and trust in reporting. Wes Lowry was there. He was talking on stage, and this has stuck with me. When he went and covered Ferguson, went to Baltimore, went to Chicago, he said nobody cared that he was with the Washington Post. They spoke to him, and they talked to him, and they trusted him because he looked like them, and he spoke like them, and they knew their language. And when I think about what veterans bring to news outlets, it's a lot of it is the same thing. We know the community, we know how to talk to veterans, we know we've gone through it. We have post-traumatic stress, we know the challenges at the VA, we've been to Afghanistan. Like, we know these communities, and we can provide really high quality, high nuanced reporting in a way that, frankly, a non-veteran, I'm sorry, Jen, cannot. There are wonderful reporters who do great reporting on military and veteran affairs every day. But some of the best reporting on Afghanistan, for example, that I saw last summer came from veterans. And so that's one thing that I think has been helpful in my career. I would also say I have a Rolodex, not a physical one, because although Bob used to have a Rolodex, sorry, Drew. And but seriously, I do have a Rolodex of contacts throughout the military, throughout the government, and I can call on them, and they'll come to me with stories. When I was living in the Central African Republic, people within the U.S. government, within the UN system, they knew who I was, they knew my background, and they came to me with stuff. And I'm sure it's the same with all the other reporters on the stage too, because they knew that I would tell the story right. So I think that's one of the things that came from my service as well.
So I'll take a little different tact. I think the thing that has most helped me as a journalist that has come from the military really stems from leadership. And I'll preface this by saying, look, I love the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps had lots of problems, but I love the Corps, and I think that had I not gone into the Corps, I would not be the person that I am today. It taught me a lot of things about myself that I did not know. It taught me things that I could do that I did not think I could do. But the thing so when I first, I took over the investigators a job ago. I took over the investigative team because my boss abruptly just quit. So I have these people who don't really know me. I've got Pulitzer Prize winners, some of them like 2. They've got other awards, and I don't have one. So I'm like, how do I speak? But then, at the same time, we were assigned to, I was asked to assign someone to go help cover the California forest fires, right? Don't get me wrong, that's important. But like, what's the investigation here? Like, why am I asking the investigative team to do that? So I'm like thinking, like, how am I gonna do this? Because they've got all of these people, and am I gonna send like Martha Mendoza, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, to go cover a forest fire? So my way out of this was just thinking in the way that we did in the Corps as a squad leader. What I did was I asked everybody on the team to make one call, feed it to me, and then I'd write the story. So nobody actually had to write it. And what happened was that people were so moved by that they were like, no, you can't do that, Rick, because the Corps, what we're taught, if you look after your people, they look after you. There's a book, this guy, he's like this, he's written a bunch of books on leadership and stuff, but the book is called Leaders Eat Last. But it's, yeah, it's basically, he just sat down and listened to people from the Marine Corps and just wrote a book. But that to me was, so 2 things from that example. One was, as a squad leader, you're always taught to know 2 jobs ahead of you. So even I was ready to step in as investigations editor, even though I never held the role before, because I was prepared for the jobs ahead of me. And secondly, is to get people to join you and not to follow you. Right? Because the Marine Corps is not, the military is not as rigid as people may think. And that's the other thing too, is like, you know, we're not automatons, right? We just don't go charge that hill, we just run up that hill. Okay, Marines do. But anyway, that's the lesson that I took. Sorry.
Well, I mean, real quick, that I remember it was the late 70s, and I was giving a talk at one of the think tanks in Washington, and leaving, and a man came up and said, "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" And I said, "No, you know, I've really got to get back to the office. By the way, what do you do?" He said, "Well, I'm in charge of intelligence oversight in the White House for Gerald Ford, the president." I said, "You know, I think I do that." But the lesson there is, and it's Bob Carroll, the great writer and investigator at the Lyndon Johnson books. And Carroll has an exhibit in New York, and it's called Turn Every Page. And I think that's true, and I just think it's, you learn as a young reporter, you make 2 calls or do 2 things, talk to 2 people, and get enough for a story. But you also can talk to 16 people if you're going to really push yourself, if you have an environment. So you have to adopt the culture and the habit of turning every page. When somebody wants to have a cup of coffee, fine. When somebody comes up to you on the street, what do you do? Oh, by the way, I just retired as the CIA director's executive assistant. Literally happened. And so I'm just, you know, I'm worried that we curtail our own opportunities by not having a very aggressive posture. And the military reporting and so forth is just a version of good reporting. And it's actually having experience in the military is a big plus for somebody reporting, not just on the Pentagon, but on almost anything. It is not, oh, you've got the badge. And that's something to exploit. And so never say no, never say, you know, I remember, I tell this story about there was someone in the Trump White House I wanted to talk to, and I had his cell phone. that he carried around himself, and I had his cell phone number. And, this is gold in the report. And so I called him one night, sitting at 8 o'clock, no answer. 9 o'clock, no answer. 10 o'clock. How many would make a call at 10 o'clock? How about 11? Exactly. And he wasn't there at 8, 9, 10, or at 11. And he answered at 11, and I said I wanted to talk, and he said, yeah, call the office. I said, I'd like to talk tonight. He said, he used a bad word to describe me. And I said, no, I really want to do it tonight. And he said, why? And I said, well, I'm 4 blocks from your house. And he said, 4 blocks from my house? How do you know where I live? I said, that's the easy part. Okay, come on over. Now, my wife was not there. That's walk. But, would you call it midnight? No, I think midnight's a little late to call. But certainly 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock.
I always feel like when I get a call at 11 o'clock, it must be some kind of emergency, so you have to answer. So it's a good strategy, right? I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. We are at the 6 o'clock mark, so maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll wrap things up. And I see a hand raising in the back. We might want to just borrow one of these mics, or if you have a loud voice, but maybe the mic, just since we are recording. Thank you.
Well, I have a question for the panel. Basically, media's changed quite a bit, right? From 20 years ago, 30 years ago, newspapers is over all the social media. So, can you talk about how to deal with getting into the social media kind of world? And then Bob, you told us a story earlier about how you met somebody when you were the Joint Chairman's courier to the White House. That might be an interesting story for everybody here if you want to tell that story.
No, I've told
Okay,
him.
all right.
Okay,
here we get up.
I can start with that. That's not my draft.
As the junior reporter at the table, I guess I can talk about social media.
You said.
I definitely did that on purpose. When I was in undergrad, social media and its use in journalism was really just coming on board as the force that it is now. I would say it was also a time in media where all of my professors warned me never to go into journalism. There's no money in it. You're going to be laid off. It was just, go into PR, go into advertising, do anything but journalism unless you love it. And I remember hearing them say that, and I remember sitting in class thinking, I don't know what else to do. I guess I'll just stay in journalism. And what they also tried to do to make sure we had resilient careers was ensure that we knew how to amplify our messages. So Facebook was a platform that was around then. LinkedIn had just been starting. I don't think there was a ton of media sharing happening then. It was more of a professional networking platform. And now I do not want to put my foot in my mouth and talk too much about Twitter because of what's been happening lately.
It may not be here.
Yeah, we will see, but even more recently, I was told I can't have a serious career in journalism if I don't have a Twitter account. So we'll see if that still holds, but there does seem to be something about using the most reputable forms of social media to amplify your message, both personally and with your news organization,
Where are those? Would you please share a list?
Well, it used to be. I'm just kidding. I'm not sure. My list that I use.
But something like Twitter, the impatience and speed of the internet defeats trying to find out what really happened because people want a phrase or a headline, and so everything gets reduced and truncated in this culture. And I think it's the death of really trying to understand something. And I think it's Look, it's part of the First Amendment, it's there, but, and not much can be done about it, but it will, really good stories live. And somebody tell me about a tweet they remember. It was not from Donald Trump.
Let me just add one thing on the social media though. And this is, I think the way that when these platforms first appeared, people were looking at these amplification, brand building and things like that. But I think the genius of people like Elliot Higgins, who founded Bellingcat, and the people who run the New York Times Visual Investigations Unit and the Washington Post Visual Forensic Unit, and the AP has of it. So it's using that, right, to tell stories and investigate, particularly in areas that we can't readily get into. So you've seen a lot of that with the coverage of Ukraine, right? Using the information that is provided, they're verifying it, of course, but that it's used as a reporting tool combined with a traditional reporting tool with all the values and the controls that we have in place as just journalists. So it becomes not so much as just like using this to like push out this or push out that, but as a source of information itself. Right? Yeah, and I think that you couldn't, we just did a thing last week called Crime Scene Bucha about the aftermath of the Russians, and we could tell by analyzing social media and intercepts of Russian troops and CCTV, combining all that with things that were posted on social, to tell the story of that those killings weren't random, they were targeted, and those people were targeted for a very specific reason, and you could tell where in the city these killings were. So that's the way I see. So I agree with Mr. Woodward here that, you know, this immediacy and this need to just push out something and the snarkiness that happens, right? Because you just want to be snarky and just say whatever comes to mind. Because, you know, I saw this is a memorable tweet, but it also shows how stupid people can be. There were people talking about wigs, and someone said, well, you know, this started in Africa or something like that. And someone tweeted, no, it didn't start in Africa, it started in Egypt. Okay. So I remember that, not because it was informative, but because just how stupid it is, to your point. That it's this idea of everybody having a voice, but it's like, what are you saying, and what does it actually add to the conversation?
I'll just add that I use Facebook still, so apparently that makes me a social media dinosaur. Allison will
I still do
confirm.
too.
Nothing else to add.
We have a question in the front here.
Yeah, hi. Phil Briggs, CBS Iron Veterans. Nice to see you guys. Thank you. It's for the whole panel, but you asked about, do I remember a great tweet? And I remember about 5 this year. And it's about the 5 that they made me take down because we were challenging a certain senator who was against the PACT Act, which we all know was a vital piece of legislation that got passed. And I guess my question really is more, are the networks, or the major news bureaus, you know, the major sources of news media, are they too cozy with the subjects, with the power elite, with those sitting in Congress? When you're told to take down something because
I'm you to take it down.
Yeah.
My editor.
Your editor.
Apparently the senator had a problem with the way he was being treated, and I was aggressive. I was less than focused maybe with some of my...
Well, did you push back?
I'm employed. So no. I still have the job. And I don't want to necessarily point fingers, which I already kind of did, but it feels to me that dovetailing from your social media launch was into the conversation here was that we're quick to publish, we're quick to need. We got the need for speed. U.S. Navy joke. We're so on deadline, we're so quick, fast, and in a hurry to make it social, to get it out there, to get it in there. And I think that compromises a lot of the integrity of it, and I don't think long-form stories like a lot of your work, Bob, would see the light of day immediately on social with any traction, because everybody wants something so fast. And when I see that combined with what I feel at a network level is a coziness to have these people well represented so that they continually come on their show, so that they can continually get the ratings.
But what was one of the tweets that your editor asked you to take down? What did it say?
I screen capped the communications between the press secretary of Senator Pat Toomey and myself, where she declined 4 separate times Senator Toomey to participate in an interview with me on the very week that he was the sole dissenter for the PACT Act, thus forcing it back to the House so that they could do the shenanigans and they could reword a couple sentences and send it back to the Senate to get passed. And it was at the point that I wouldn't take no for an answer, and I wanted everybody to see that this is what the power elite do when challenged. And I went on to then use a little Queen's English. I went on then in a 3rd or 4th tweet to mention that he's either a coward or a liar. And I felt...
But the first one was just factual, right?
Yeah. And I was told...
Somebody said take it down?
Yeah.
I mean,
and I just wonder, are the news networks
I think what
too
Carl
cozy?
Bernstein would do if somebody was trying to do that to him. And I think, backbone and perseverance go together. And I understand you're adapting to a boss, but I find that deeply offensive that somebody would ask that, and I would protest, frankly.
All right. Let's ask one more question from the
Let me
audience.
call your boss and say,
Does anybody else have one last question? Yeah, in the back.
Hi, I'm Tori Sneed. I'm a former public affairs specialist and a current journalist student at UMD. What is one skill as a veteran you would suggest when trying to get into journalism on the civilian side that we should leverage?
That's a great question.
I always encourage people to learn multimedia skills. The reality is that a lot of outlets are going to be pushing their reporters to be able to shoot photos and do videos and be able to write and do everything because they want everything and they want it done cheap and they want it done fast. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of what it is. It means that the quality of all those things goes down. But that's, in terms of breaking into the business, I've found that that's been very useful when you've been able to show and demonstrate that you can produce all of that.
I would also say just leverage your experience as a veteran, right? Like, as a veteran, like, you're gonna meet deadlines, because we have to, right? And 2, like, they know that you're gonna be persistent, right? Because there are things that you have to do, to get to, you gotta pass that, right? So there are things that you gotta do when you go to, whatever, if you would call it AIT or whatever everybody else calls it. I don't know what all the other services call them, but like, you gotta pass that, right? I remember in the Marine Corps, like, I couldn't swim, and I went to the Corps not knowing the whole part, like Marine. But I realized that if I didn't pass my combat swim, that means I had to go back and wait for 2 weeks until a class came 2 weeks. So that meant I had to stay on Paris Island for like 4 more weeks. There's no way in hell I was going to stay on Paris Island for 4 more weeks. So I got out my Foot Locker and practiced swimming with no water. But I passed on my.
With no water?
No water. But I passed my last day on my last try to get the hell out of there but again, it's that persistence that journalists have to have. I mean, this man's the epitome of it, right? That as a vet, those are just the skills that you have.
We gotta go.
Yep, we gotta go.
I just had like one more, a couple more to add. I think if you can show that whether through leadership or any of the past work that you've done while in the military that you have good judgment, the ability to use that discernment, that's invaluable. Some people have to literally be told what to look for. Not everyone is either intuitive or intellectually practiced, and if you can demonstrate that, let's say you don't have the writing chops yet, you can get them. Some skills you can learn, some things you can't necessarily be taught, but if you were in the military, you can definitely capitalize on instances when you use that good judgment. Great answer.
Yeah.
Bob, would you like to close us out?
Find a good story.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. Happy Veterans Day.